Today's story is the first of several stories that center around a creature that shows up a lot in modern depictions of historical Japan. That creature being the kitsune, or the fox. Foxes were believed to have magical powers and that they used these powers to do all sorts of things, but mostly they just played pranks on humans. In some ways, the foxes depicted in these very old folktales differ from how they are depicted in anime and games, but there is a reason that they have captured the imagination of so many people for over 1,000 years, and that is precisely what you will see in today's story. Yokoso owashitare, and welcome back to yet another classical Japanese folktale. So if you like Japanese history, or you like Japanese culture, or you just like storytelling in general, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel because there are still plenty more stories where this one came from. And as of recording this video, we are just a little bit away from hitting 5,000 subscribers, which is, I mean, I never thought it would get this big. I was just doing this because I thought it was amusing and fun and it was an excuse to get me to study classical Japanese. But thank you so much for your support, guys. Almost there to 5,000, that would be great. If we can get that probably even in the next week, that would be amazing. But anyways, I know there's a lot going on in the world right now, but for the next few minutes, just set everything aside and let's enjoy a very old Japanese folktale about a fox. Once upon a time, ima wa mukashi. There was a man of the Nakatomi clan who was a priest of the Grand Shrine of Kasuga. Now this man's name has been lost to time, but that's actually not a huge problem because he's not actually the main character of our story. That honor belongs to this priest's nephew, another man whose name has been lost to time, but who held the position of Chutaifu, which simply meant something like middle officer. Essentially, this Chutaifu was of middling rank in the nobility, but he still had some very powerful family connections in the form of his aforementioned uncle. However, this Chutaifu was, at the very least, wealthy enough to have servants and horses. And our story begins with one of those very horses suddenly going missing. Now this horse had been let out to pasture, and perhaps because someone forgot to shut a door, or perhaps because there had been a break in some enclosure, this horse, presumably, wandered off somewhere and hadn't come back all day long. This was a problem. Horses were not only very useful, but very, very expensive. They were also a status symbol, and to the people of this time, status was everything. So losing a horse was not something you could just brush off. This horse needed to be brought back ASAP. But this Chutaifu wasn't like his higher-ranking peers. While he had underlings who usually handled the actual day-to-day labor of running his house, he didn't have a lot of them. And when this horse went missing, almost all of his servants were busy with their several duties and couldn't afford to go traipsing around the area, possibly for hours on end, looking for a lost horse. With almost no one else capable of doing so, the Chutaifu would have to go find the horse himself. Now, this wasn't the biggest problem. I mean, this Chutaifu wasn't a lazy or an overly entitled man, but while he was capable in his own right, and he wasn't above getting his hands a little dirty when something needed to get done, he wasn't a trained outdoorsman or a seasoned warrior, and scouring the countryside alone would have been a very bad idea. Not only could he potentially get lost since they weren't in the capital city, but there were all sorts of things that could get him. Bandits, wild animals, tripping over a tree root, hitting your head on a rock and dying slowly out in the cold, dark wilds. And of course, there were other things, dark things, that stalked the less populated places and had abilities beyond the understanding of mortal men. It was dangerous to go alone. Luckily for this Chutaifu, though, one of his underlings was fairly skilled in these sorts of things, and it just so happened that he wasn't as busy as the other servants. Perfect. So, that evening, the Chutaifu called this skilled servant to him and explained that they needed to set out and find the lost horse. The underling, a very dutiful man, gladly accepted the Chutaifu's order with no reservations, and after a few preliminary preparations, the two men each grabbed a bow and a quiver of arrows and set out from the property on foot. Now, the Chutaifu's home was on the south side of the former capital city of Nara, in a place that was rather sparsely populated called Mihashi. After leaving the property, these two men decided that the best place to begin searching was in the hills to the east, and promptly headed in that direction, looking for the path of least resistance, as horses generally aren't fond of walking through needlessly difficult terrain. Now, the timing of this horse's disappearance made things a little bit worse. By the time everyone realized it was gone and word had made it to the Chutaifu, the day had already been mostly spent, and the two men didn't end up setting out until after the sun had already begun setting. They had only gone a short distance, maybe a quarter of a mile, when the sun was completely past the horizon and dusk arrived. By the time they actually made it to the hills, there was barely any glow left in the west to see by. Now, they had hoped that the moon, which was full that night, would offer some decent light to see by, but a layer of hazy clouds had rolled in and severely diminished the moon's brightness. Absolutely rotten luck. But despite the lack of light, these two men trudged along through the dark, keeping their eyes out for any sign of a missing horse. They couldn't give up just because the circumstances weren't ideal. They knew there were some nice fields out this way, and they were hoping that if they checked them, the horse would be there nonchalantly grazing away among the wild grasses, as horses tend to do. But despite looking high and low, their searching brought no luck. Every potentially enticing meadow was barren of any creature bigger than a mouse. But despite the difficulty of searching the rugged terrain of the foothills in hazy moonlight and the lack of success thus far, they couldn't give up just yet. Maybe if they went just a little bit further, they might find it. As they moved deeper and deeper into the hills, they suddenly came across something neither of them expected at all. There, in the dim moonlight, they spotted a towering mass of black that seemed to stretch endlessly to the sky. Curious, the men moved a little closer and soon realized that this gargantuan shadow was actually an absolutely massive Japanese cedar tree known as a sugi no ki. Now, cedar trees are a dime a dozen in Japan, and normally seeing one wouldn't have been noteworthy in the slightest, but this tree was unbelievably huge. Now, Japanese cedar trees can get pretty big, most being between about 50 and 80 feet in height, but this one was on another level. The men guessed that the trunk was somewhere in the vicinity of 12 or 13 feet in diameter, while the tree itself stood over 200 feet tall, more than twice the size of a typical cedar tree. The sight was enough to make the Chutaifu stop in his tracks and stare. He couldn't help but bend backwards a little to try to see the top, which he could just make out against the silver glow of the moon behind the misty clouds. He almost couldn't believe it. None of the surrounding trees could even hold a candle to their massive neighbor, and he was surprised that such a legendarily large tree could be so close to where he lived without him hearing about it. Usually, such insanely big trees were revered by the locals as a kind of protectorate deity, and even outsiders would travel to them to pray and make offerings. How had this one escaped his notice? Strange. The Chutaifu stood there for a few moments, wondering about this tree, until he hit on an idea. But being a very sensible man, he decided that he needed some external confirmation before coming to any conclusions. And then he called for the underling to come close. And when he did his bid, the Chutaifu then asked this underling, "Am I seeing things? Or have we been deceived by some kind of a trickster god and are being led down some kind of sinister path? Tell me, can you see this ridiculously massive tree too?" The underling replied, "Indeed I can, sir." The Chutaifu then continued, "Then I guess I'm not just seeing things. That only makes me further believe that we ran into something on the road here that's trying to throw us for a loop. But I might be wrong. Tell me, have you ever heard of or seen a cedar tree this big anywhere else in the country?" The underling shook his head and then he answered, "No, sir. I have heard in one particular place there is a very large cedar tree, but from what I've heard, even that one is nowhere near the size of this one." The Chutaifu then knit his brow in concern, thought for another few seconds and said, "Yeah, I'm pretty positive we are being led around by something unseen, and I'm not entirely sure what to do about it. It's all very unnerving, to be honest. For now, though, I think we should just head back home, even without the horse. We've come a fair distance, and the further we move away from the house, the more likely we are to end up in bad straits and in the hands of whatever it is that conjured this tree. Ugh, honestly, what a terrible, terrible outcome." The Chutaifu then turned around and began walking back the way that they had come. But he had only gone a few steps before the underling stopped him and said, "Sir, I understand that we're in a bit of a bind, but I feel like it would be too much of a waste to have come all of this way and have nothing to show for it. This tree is definitely weird and shouldn't be here in the first place, so why don't we shoot it and see what happens? It might be too dark to see how it reacts now, but we can always come back tomorrow morning and check when the sun's out and we can actually see the details." After another short space of thinking, the Chutaifu figured that, well, it couldn't hurt, and he said, "You make a very good point. Well then, let's both put an arrow in it for good measure." Each man then knocked an arrow in his bow and faced the tree. Now that they were both convinced that it was something unnatural, and they had decided that they were now going to antagonize it, it seemed more menacing than before, as it towered above them huge and dark in the faint gray moon. They hesitated, but the underling, rousing his courage, said to the Chutaifu, "Sir, I think we should get a little bit closer before we shoot. It's still a little hard to see in this darkness, and we'd best make sure our shots count." The Chutaifu agreed, whereupon the two men took a few paces toward the tree together. They both had a bad feeling about this tree, and had they not had each other, I doubt either of them would have even stuck around, let alone actually approach what they genuinely believed was some kind of inhuman magic. But once both of them felt like they were close enough that there was no way that they could miss, but still feeling very nervous, they raised their bows, aimed, and fired. Both arrows were swallowed by the night's deep shadows as they sped away and buried themselves into the tree with a distinct wooden thud. But as soon as the two men heard the very clear sounds of the arrows finding their mark, this massive, towering blackness of the tree vanished, leaving only empty moonlight in its stead. What happened? Where did it go? Yes, it was clearly something magical, and they were expecting some kind of a strange reaction, but for such a large thing to just completely disappear? Unheard of. They had heard the sounds of arrows striking wood, and they were sure that the massive tree hadn't just been a trick of the eyes. But it was so dark that it was hard to tell exactly what happened. There was only one explanation. "I knew it," the Chutaifu said. "We've come across some kind of spirit intent on getting us lost. I don't know about you, but I'm not thrilled to be here. Come on, let's just get back." The underling nodded in agreement, and both of them spun on their heels and took off running as fast as they could manage in the darkness. A short time later, they arrived back at the house safe and relatively sound, although there was no telling what may or may not have followed them home. With nothing really else to do, though, both men just went to their separate rooms and hunkered down as best as they could. No doubt, they tried sleeping, but whether they were able to do so is left unwritten. They had no clue what it was that they had come across in the hills, but it clearly was something supernatural. I can only imagine that the fear that they had angered this thing, and that it might be tracking them down, made sleep extremely difficult, if not impossible. I probably wouldn't have been able to sleep, at least, not after hearing stories about how Oni can sometimes track down victims that manage to escape once, only to then get devoured later. See the story about the Oni of Agi Bridge for more information about that. But the wee hours of the night passed uneventfully, and eventually, dawn came. Sleep or no, they were both eager to go back and check the place out. If there was the possibility that something might be out to get them, then it would behoove them to investigate the area and plan accordingly. And so, in the light of the early morning sun, the Chutaifu called the same underling from before, and together they once again headed east into the hills. Now that the pathway was easy to see and they weren't checking every nook and cranny for an escaped horse, it didn't take them long to arrive at the place in question. When they approached the spot where the incredibly large cedar tree had been, they found something that neither of them were expecting at all. There, lying on the ground, was a hairless fox, its skin withered and wrinkled with age, and 2 arrows sticking out of its chest. But the thing that most astounded them was that it was carrying a single cedar branch in its mouth. Needless to say, it was very clearly dead. After an initial shock, the Chutaifu moved over to the fox and said, "Ah, So it was this little rascal who was trying to pull a fast one on us. I have no doubt that the realization that it was just a fox came as a relief to this man. Of the many things that like to cause problems for humans, there were far worse things than foxes. Oni, especially the Onigami, had magical abilities as well, but used them mostly for killing and eating people. Foxes, on the other hand, much like the Kusainagi from the previous few videos, tended mostly to just be a nuisance and got kicks out of scaring people without causing them serious harm. It being a fox meant that neither of these men needed to be afraid that some kind of violent, vengeful spirit would hunt them down for dinner or for revenge, and both the Chutaifu and his underling could sleep safely the next time their heads hit the pillow. Having confirmed the identity of the culprit, the Chutaifu then bent down, removed the 2 arrows from the fox's body, and then he and his underling headed back to the house. This time at a nice, leisurely, casual pace. And that's pretty much where the story ends. Now some of you might be wondering, wait, what the heck happened to the horse? Well, couldn't tell you. I'm guessing it was fine. Maybe it ran off and showed up in a completely unexpected place where some peasant saw it and then assumed that it was some kind of horse god or something and then told everybody around him, and it turned into a story that became a whole other folktale that didn't make it into this collection. But fanciful imaginings aside, at the end of this story, the writer gives his closing opinion along with the moral of the story. First, the writer comments that this story happened only 2 or 3 years before he compiled this collection, and that he thought it was fascinating that such stories of wonder and magic could happen in what to him was a late degenerate age. And thus is it said that you should always be suspicious of paths that seem to be leading you to nowhere. If you feel like something is off out there in the wilds, apparently there's a good chance that something is trying to lure you away. And if you're lucky, it will only be a fox that just wants to show you how big its cedar impression is. But that is where I'm going to end this story, so if you did find that story amusing, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because again, there's still plenty more stories to get through, and there are plenty other stories that, if you're new to this channel, that I've already done. I've been doing this for about 2.5 years at this point. And please feel free to get the word out. Please share with your Japanese cultural loving friends, your anime friends, because I mean, a lot of these stories do lead into like old school Meiji period classical literature. I'm thinking Akutagawa Ryunosuke, who then leads into influences like modern anime and stuff to some degree. And again, we're almost to 5,000 subscribers, and when we hit that, obviously, I would think it would be great. I think it would be great if we did hit that, but, you know, we can easily go past that too, so please feel free to share with anybody who you think you might be interested, or who just needs something to put on in the background while they do, like, I don't know, laundry, or are stuck in traffic. Apparently, though, I've heard that a lot of you guys like to listen to this while you sleep, which, I mean, that's cool. I mean, I don't think my voice is particularly that appealing, but if you guys like it, so much more power to you. And with all of that being said, I do thank you sincerely, ito ureshiu koso hamberikere, and hopefully we will see you next week for yet another story about a fox that does one thing that foxes are very famous for in modern media, but also does another thing that is not so well known and is actually kind of gross, or really gross. Anyways, that is where I'm going to end it. Thank you so much, guys. See you later. Goodbye.